I would like to welcome our speaker, Dr. O'Connell, Christine, okay. Assistant Professor of Biological Sciences at Chapman University, local expert on soil science, and a Bungalow Heaven resident. Thank you so much.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I'm a college professor, so I usually walk around and ask you guys questions and stuff like that. Does that seem okay? Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Christine Sierra O'Connell. My pronouns are she, her, and aya. I'm a soil scientist. I'm a Bungalow Heaven resident by coincidence. And I'm one of the researchers who has been kind of tracking soil contamination and public health consequences around the Eaton fire and to a lesser extent around the Palisades fire. And obviously I'm pretty personally invested in this because we have a small child at home, and we know a lot of people who were impacted way more so than us, but also less so than us. And it's been a real honor and a privilege to be able to do scientific work that helps people so directly. Some of the Bungalow Heaven folks emailed me questions, and then I added to them that I'm very commonly asked. So I'll go through them really, really quickly, and there's some that will be very naturally answered by the stuff I already have lined up, and some not so much. Okay, instead of ranking them by interest, I rank them by how much we know. So basically decreasing level of confidence as we go down this list. So at the top, a lot of people ask me things like, I got my soils tested. How do I read my results? Or also very commonly, what do I do now? What is the risk? So usually you get some kind of data about what's contaminating your soil, but it's not totally obvious what that really means for you. And I'll say there's, mixed levels of data because not very much time has gone by about that. And then what can we do? So we have, we, the scientific community and, public health researchers, etc., have things we are definitely communicating about this stuff that I will be super clear about, and of course we'll answer a lot of questions about. So I wrote solid local data for our area and this fire. So this category is a little more gray area. This is either we only have okay local data, or we have data from other fires, TBD if it applies here, or we don't really know very much, but it's a very popular question. So in this category I put, what's the deal with the fact that this is an urban environment and probably there was already some soil contamination? Lots of people want to know about that. Data is limited, but we have some ideas. What's the deal with whether or not I can eat anything that got grown in this area? I wrote vegetables, but this applies to fruit as well. Very mixed data record here. So it's hard to have definitive answers, unfortunately. And then how often should we be monitoring soil quality, and are there local resources or services? That part is a very clear answer. How often you need to do this, also a little more gray area-y. And then there's good answers to these, but I'm not an expert in these areas. I can point to general sources of information and give very broad answers, but I didn't line up a ton of information about if there are lingering air quality concerns. The very short answer is broadly no. And water contamination stuff, which I'm also not an expert in, and that is definitely of concern for those of you who are kind of marine conservationists. And both of these are actively being studied, and I can point out where you guys can get that sort of information. Okay, right off the bat, does anyone see a glaring hole that they would really like noted in our categories? Great. Oh yes.
Well,
sorry, it was Jessica, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Is there sort of enough data that we have a sense of the range of what can be expected in terms of soil contamination in this area?
Yeah.
In a general sense?
Totally. I'll show you a bunch of numbers that we have really good numbers about. Well, that's not quite true. So like one thing that I think is often glossed over in these conversations is the fact that after a mega fire, especially one that involved combustion of man-made items, especially one that involved the combustion of like tons of man-made items, there are numerous contaminants that are potentially of concern. And many of those we do not have good data on. But luckily, unluckily, one of the primary public health related contaminants of concern, which is heavy metals, particularly lead, we have probably the best data stream about. So to me, and I think the broad consensus, is that the contaminants that are approximately the most kind of like hazardous at a community level and of public health concern, we are tracking quite closely. I think a lot of the other contaminants that aren't being tracked quite closely are a really big question mark. Like, and these are more like contaminants that are relatively new, like forever chemicals, you might know them as PFAS. Like, people usually think of PFAS as one thing, but that's hundreds of different contaminants. And we don't always have a strong sense of what the actual implications of being raised as a child near those contaminants is. And we don't have good data about how widespread they already were, and we don't have good data about how widespread they are after the Eden fire. So approximately the stuff we're really worried about, which is metals, we know a lot about. There's all these other edge cases that a lot of researchers are looking at, but they're harder to test, more expensive. We don't have good markers from other fires, so we can't extrapolate as easily, etc. Does that answer your question? But the metal stuff, I'll circle back to. Yeah.
Do you have any data on how close or proximity to the fire, or how far away you've got to be?
Yeah, I'll show you a bunch of that data for sure. Yeah.
I was wondering, I haven't done any kind of testing at all.
Sure.
I'm 77. By the time I get cancer from some of these problems, I'll be dead anyway.
Sure.
Is that a bury the head in the sand type thing, or should I get tested, have tests done anyway?
Yeah, I mean, can I punt on that? I have an opinion, but I think it might be more helpful for people to hear my opinion after they see some of the ranges of some of these numbers.
Okay.
But I don't feel like...
Sometime during the process.
Yeah, for sure. And like, ping me if I don't circle back to your exact question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Stafsler.
Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi. My question is piggybacking off of this and kind of related to, do we have reliable community level data, maybe in the wake of other mega fires about cancer rates 5 years, 10 years out, that kind of stuff on a community scale?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I think most public health researchers are seeing this fire as the one that's probably going to provide data for the future fires.
Cool.
Because, yeah, I love that for us. Yeah, Paradise can have, for instance, things like the population density, the same type of housing stock, etc. And I think a lot of these extrapolations are a lot easier when you have a really big population you can follow for a long time. So most of these other fires have impacted much smaller groups of people. Okay, I just want to make sure we're getting through this. Does anyone mind if I kind of like show us some data? Cool. Great. Or not, does anyone mind? Does anyone like desperately need us to not do that now? All right, so I'm going to show you first some data from our team, which is pretty in the weeds. And then probably the next place I'll stop is just to like click ahead. I'm going to show you some data talking about like the science of what we know about this in general and the data that our team has produced. And then I put up a bunch of slides with a lot of the community-wide data that's mostly coming out of these community-facing initiatives that some of you might have interacted with, or for those of you who haven't or are thinking about whether or not you want to get your soils tested, I'll walk through the 3 main ways to do that for free and the data that they've provided to the public. Okay, so most people who are looking at contaminants in soil around the Eden fire are basically asking some version of the question, what contaminants are there? How bioaccessible are they? Which is a jargony word for if you get that contaminant into your system, does it actually do anything to you? Or do you kind of like pee it out, like so many children's vitamins? And you're really rooting to just pee it out. And like the answer to that is going to vary really dramatically based on your biology, whether or not you're part of a vulnerable group, and what the contaminant is, what concentration it was at, etc. The forms of the contaminant, etc. So our group is like pretty in the weeds on the actual science of heavy metal, like geochemistry and bioaccessibility. So I know quite a bit about that and also a lot about kind of the public health side. So what we're actually looking at is, this is not from around Eaton. This is one of my collaborators, Ratish Ranavengran, and he's using, you might have heard of this if you've done any of your testing, it's called an XRF sensor analyzer, and it basically is like a little sensor that sends out X-rays, excites atoms, and the X-rays fluoresce back, and then it kind of tells you very roughly, with some level of confidence, the concentration of a bunch of different elements. And these are really widely used in like sources like this is a school that was located on a former industrial site and wanted to know whether or not soils were contaminated if they wanted to expand their playground. It's being used in basically all of the big Eaton fire studies right now because it's cheap, quite good at metals, and you can do a bunch of tests really, really quickly. So what we're doing is, this is our backyard, like my backyard in Bungalow Heaven. We're basically going to look at only the remaining soil. So our study and many of these other partner studies, they're not looking at the stuff that's going to get scraped away if your house was impacted directly by the fire. They're looking at all the soil where your dog is hanging out, you're sitting for a picnic, your kid is digging, that kind of stuff. And then we're just kind of like splitting up the yard, taking a bunch of samples, and then we go back to the lab and we run them through basically a fake stomach to say, like, okay, we know what's in here, there's X amount of lead, Y amount of arsenic, whatever, and then we put it in a warm, acidic environment, shake it up, kind of the way that your stomach is sort of like doing gastric palpations, and we look at what amount dissolved into the equivalent of your stomach acid, and it gives you kind of a rough sense of like, how much of the stuff would actually get into your bloodstream. I think like one thing that broadly the public health community is trying to share out about is, I think people often think like, oh, the real hazard is like eating dirt, and my kid doesn't like shove dirt in their mouth anymore, so it's not a big deal. But actually the vast majority of the way that you're ingesting these contaminants is through these really fine particles that you don't visually see. It's not like making a mud pie and pretending to eat it. It's like, you know, grime on your hands that you were like gardening or whatever, and then you eat a sandwich that your spouse brings to you, and these like small amounts of dust are getting onto the sandwich and then getting into your mouth. So I think like this sort of like cumulative ingestion over time is actually what's happening at kind of like the biological level to potentially impact your health.
Unvertical is less than 3 kilometers, and how much is that in miles?
3 kilometers, it's like a little over 1 mile. So yeah, our furthest away house is like 1.5 miles from the edge of the fire. It's actually in Bungalow Heaven. Oh no, we have one house further than Bungalow Heaven. All right, so the biggest result that I'm showing you our group's data, which is a combination or collaboration between Chapman, the University of California, Davis, and the University of California, Merced. But our results have been mirrored by all these other studies, which is great. Like you want a bunch of independent studies showing you pretty much know what's going on. So what you're looking at here is a graph that's looking at lead PB, that's lead on the kind of elemental table. Concentration, high concentrations over here, lower concentrations over here. And then the y-axis is basically like, think of the number of samples we found. The actual units don't really matter. This is like a statistical measure of density. Color is if your house was burned, and blue is if your house was not burned at all. So some of these homes are inside the burn zone, some of them are as far south as us, one's a little bit further south than us. So the first thing I want to point out is that broadly, there's a few dashed lines I should draw your attention to. This dashed line at 200 parts per million is the EPA standard for being beyond that in a residential soil is basically like a no-no. So this is too contaminated, like EPA suggests remediation. And if something's actually happening that the government is involved in, they will remediate at this point. 80 is the California Department of Toxic Substance Control recommendation for residential soils. So like action basically required beyond here, action recommended to pursue potential action is suggested by the state here. And then the dark lines are the mean for these two different groups. So you can see that in general, regardless of whether or not a structure actually burned down in your house, the houses in general, these 20 houses that are like 400-ish samples that we looked at, are falling around the mean, but a big chunk of them are existing in this area between what California thinks probably isn't great and what the EPA says definitely isn't great. The actual numbers are that in our data set, about 35% of observations are above the California recommendation, about 7% are above the EPA limit. Those are broadly mirrored by the USC data set, the UCLA data set, the county data set. The county commissioned a separate data set early on, and those are all kind of in the ballpark. That there's a big chunk of houses in this 80 to 200, not great range, and then a smaller chunk of houses that are kind of above the EPA no-go zone. Okay. I was going to show you some more specific stuff about this within properties, but I actually think since there were so many questions about distance, we can skip ahead and I'll show you a bunch of the kind of like publicly available geographies. And I suspect there'll probably be a bunch of questions here. So if you want to get your soil tested, there's 3 very common free ways to do it. The first is by going through a program called USC Clean. And we can click through and look at these in a second. But USC Clean, you go into your own yard, you collect your own soil. They have a really specific set of things they want you to do on the website. But fundamentally what you do is you collect your own soil following their guideline and you send it in the mail to USC. And then within a couple of weeks, they only look at lead and they email you your results. And then your results will eventually go, I think actually to get this service you have to agree to have your data be public, but it's not, it's geo-jiggled, so it's not associated with your specific house. You kind of go onto the sample map. So you can see we're here-ish, and I guess one thing I wanted to note is there is tons of variability. So the white is totally fine. The dark blue is the very dark blue, which there are hardly any of. There's one here, one here. There's another EPA level that's kind of defined as hazardous, and there have been a few houses in all these data sets that kind of show up in few individual samples as over 1,000 parts per million. Reminder that 200 is kind of the EPA standards, is 5x that. And then you can see it's not totally obvious that just because you live here instead of here instead of here, that your soil, there's not a clear gradation of very contaminated by lead, medium, low. Very broadly, we do tend to think that Santa Ana winds during the fire were going this way, so being further out east is a bit indicative that you have a higher likelihood of having a lower soil lead load. But here in Bungalow Heaven, it's a bit of a crapshoot. Before I ask for questions, let me show you one more map, which is the UCLA map. Okay, so the second of the 3 free resources I was going to point out is this other group called CAP.LA. That's a consortium that's mostly run out of UCLA, but they also have a bunch of other partners like Purdue University, Loyola Marymount, Cal Poly Pomona, and I think UT Austin, but I'm actually forgetting the last one. Same kind of thing, you go out into your yard, you collect soil, and I'm actually blanking on if you mail it to them or if they have drop-offs. I think Grocery Outlet might be one of the drop-offs, yeah.
You dropped it off.
Yeah, I think you could also mail it, maybe? Or it's only Grocery Outlet?
Then you would take it to them down at their university.
Oh, okay, gotcha. So yeah, they do pop-up drop-offs. And here to solve the kind of privacy issue, instead of geo-jiggling, they kind of split everything into areas. So you can see, and what you're looking at is the proportion of houses, I believe, that are above a certain threshold. But dark is bad, lighter color is better. And you can see that in our zone, it's not ideal, even though, obviously we're not at the fire perimeter edge. Okay, I wanted to open it up. I thought this would be a good pause. I do have both of these websites queued up. Or actually, before I pause, the third one, which their data is not that accessible, but this is also a great free resource, is LA County. Also does their own soil testing. It's a little bit hard to Google. You have to Google LA County Eaton Fire Soil Testing Program. Because you Google LA County Eaton Fire Soil, there's like a million other resources. Like this is the dashboard that brings you to all of the public data that anyone has made available. But it's kind of obvious when you get to the soil testing page. And here what they're doing to protect anonymity is splitting things up by zip code. So our zip code across all of the soil that's been tested through this program had 48% of all samples in that 80 to 200 range, had 24% of samples above 200, so in that EPA kind of like warning zone, and 26% of samples above 80. So our zip code only has about 1 in 4 samples that are coming back below the California warning level. All right, I'm happy. I feel like this is a good moment to pause. A lot of the time people have a lot of questions about this. And like I said, I do have the websites open. We can click around them if that would be helpful. Yeah.
I recall, I might be wrong on this, but I recall like one of the testing programs indicated that there was like something like a 25% margin of error. Is that correct? And can you speak a little bit about like how precise these results are?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So I mentioned before I showed that picture of like the XRF sensor and, oh sorry, so the question was what's the deal with the margin of error and how tight, how confident are scientists in these results? Yeah, so I know that, I think CapLA does this and I'm quite confident that USC does this. They send you back results with kind of like a standard deviation. So they give you like a sense of, for your exact soil, what they think the range is, and I think they do that by doing like 3 samples within it. And I'll say that like part of the reason why USC is only reporting the lead results is that these X-ray, these XRF scanners, they're not that reliable at very low concentrations. So some of these less common contaminants, like think cadmium for batteries, even arsenic, which is probably like the second most common thing that's showing up in people's soils. You don't want even like 3 parts per million of arsenic in your soil. You really want it to be like the background rate, which is 1, or you don't want 7, for instance. But like, if you're not scanning you don't have a very large sample size of soil, it's kind of hard to distinguish between 7, 0, and 15, which would have like relatively large discrepancies in how you might interpret that. But since lead numbers naturally are higher in the background rate, and that's okay, the background rate is probably around 20 parts per million, like pretty much this technology is doing very well with lead. So that's actually really convenient because lead is also the contaminant that's kind of the most interest to public health researchers right now. Again, sort of approximately. So yeah, I would say like, here's how I usually think about the data coming out of this. I think of XRF data, which again is like pretty much all these free samples are going to be using XRF data as sort of like, no pun intended, my scanning baseline. So like this is how we tested our own house. And we mostly use it to kind of think like, that part of the yard is definitely like worse than that part of the yard. And like, are we in the ballpark of like this cutoff line or that cutoff line? And I think if your number comes back at like, let's say it comes back at like 120, it's not actually 20. Like it might actually be 105 or 145, but like you kind of know you're in that zone. Does that help?
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
What's the function of time with wind, rain, percolation?
Yeah, so to just repeat the question, how does time influence this? So it's something that's actively being researched, but very broad rule of thumb is that we think of metals as sticking around. We think of organic contaminants, so this would be things like, you might have heard of PAHs, that's polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. Those are sort of like created from non-complete combustion, so fire byproducts, and they are associated with being carcinogens and a few other kind of like long-term health concerns, but they are organic molecules. and so are PFAS molecules. So basically, in rule of thumb, anything that's an organic molecule, microbes will eventually break down. Like organic stuff, other things eat. So interventions like adding compost or doing like other types of bioremediation are quite effective at organic molecules, but we're still talking on the order of years to break this stuff down. And for some of these things, like decades. Metals, we think about them sticking around for a really long time. Especially the stuff that didn't wash away like right off the bat. Like we have started to do some time series stuff, and we're not seeing really demonstrated reductions. And I don't think it's the kind of thing that you sort of like count on to go away. Yeah.
All three of the slides that you took pictures of, those are all freebie ones?
Yeah.
And do any of the freebie ones check for arsenic? Because my next door neighbor.
Yeah, Cap LA checks for arsenic.
It was not only lead, but arsenic.
Yeah.
And she's right next door, so.
Yeah, although I would just to like reassure you, I think being next door doesn't necessarily mean that much. I mean, very broadly it does, but like, you know what I mean? Like these houses are probably only half a block apart, and they're pretty demonstrably different. This is only lead again. But Cap LA checks for 14 metals. And I actually have never seen any of the results from the county directly. Has anyone here done the county testing? Yeah, what did they send back?
Just lead.
Just lead?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
What is a possible explanation for these differences? How come?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So, like, one of the community questions that came up was, do we know very much about historical lead loading? And I think these heterogeneities we, in some part, associate with historical changes. So, like, people ask me this question a lot, like, hey, haven't we all just been around all this lead all the time and our kids just totally fine? Like, I grew up with all this lead, how do we know it's not just exactly the same?
Lead paint that we grew up with.
Yeah, I mean, basically all of this newly added lead is from lead paint from these houses at 10,000 homes in Altadena that burned down. Like, layers and layers of lead paint, right? So I guess I usually say two things to that. Like, there is really good evidence that probably most of the soils in this entire area already had elevated lead. From our own data, we have done a few trials where we dig down below the surface, and those lead levels are also elevated. So like, that's not coming from the Eden fire. We did that in the week after the fire. And we also know from across LA, both the city and the basin, that there are lots of patches, in part associated with former industrial use, in part associated with kind of like leaded gasoline and your proximity to things like highways or major thoroughfares. That sort of like lead gasoline is combusted when we still have leaded gasoline, and it's sort of like, you know, that smog and whatever is kind of like landing in the area around things like highways from the 50s and 60s, etc. So like, maybe some of it's from that. I also think, yeah, totally. Like, you know, this is a major city that has been an industrial city for a very long time. So I think certainly these homes have had lead in their soil far before the Eden fire. That said, so I think like maybe that's okay, although I would also argue like that's not great, right? Like I don't think that kids in the 70s should have been growing up around lead either. And just because it happened to them doesn't mean it should definitely happen to our kids. So I guess the second point I usually make is we are very confident that new lead was added to these environments. Like we know that because there was lead in the materials that combusted. We also know from trials testing actual direct ash that it's very elevated in lead, all the Eden fire ash, and we know that that ash landed on our soils. So at the very least, like new stuff that has contaminants absolutely is raising these lead levels. The delta between what they used to be and what they are now, we have very poor data around. Most of the historic studies that have looked at, like even from the 90s, lead in LA, didn't come as far north as this. They really were looking at like South LA, kind of like Torrance, these more industrial sites. So we can sort of extrapolate from that. You know, these more impacted parts of Los Angeles, we're probably coming out to be in like the mid 100s. So above that 80 and below that 200, that difference between that California standard and the EPA standard. But I don't know, and I don't think anybody knows what Altadena and Pasadena used to be like. I mean, certainly, I don't know certainly, but I suspect above the background crustal level, which is about 20 parts per million, you're not going to find 20 parts per million lead in many industrialized, long-term urban environments in the US. So it's not surprising to me that very few of these houses are testing at 20, 30, 40 parts per million. But I also think that there is new contamination that has been introduced to our system, and we're quite confident that it's on the top layer of soil that your kids and dogs are interacting with. So it's like proximately available to get into your system more easily than some of this really old stuff. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Of the three free soil testing options, which one do you recommend?
Oh, great question. I don't have an opinion. I know the scientists who run all three, and they actively coordinate about their methods. And we tested our own house in my study, so I didn't actually use any of them. Did anyone love their experience with one of these three? Yeah.
Because they did 14.
Yeah, I think what I've heard anecdotally is that Cap LA tests more metals and USC is faster. I'm not sure about that, if that's still true, but I think that's kind of the rule of thumb. Did anyone else love their experience? Any other votes of confidence? Or hate their experience? I don't know as much about that county one because it's a lot newer.
I can speak to that one. I wouldn't say I hated my experience going for the county, but I would say, you know, they indicate on their website, we'll get back to you within 7 to 10 business days. It was about a month.
I was like, there's no way it was 7 to 10 business days.
It took follow-up with me, both in person and reaching out to the department, the County Department of Public Health, to get a point of contact to say, hey, can we move this along? I want to find out what kind of risk my family and I are at.
So yeah, there's probably some trade-off between like number of metals and how fast we're getting the results. Oh, and I'll do one more plug. I think the best explainer of how to interpret your results is the USC one. They collaborated with a bunch of their outreach folks and some graphic designers. I always point people, this QR code is live, but this just brings you to a PDF that's called reading your results, and they send it to everyone when they send back their results, and it's 20 pages long, extremely helpful. Several of the figures that they created for this, the county now uses in their how to interpret your results guidance. This might be a good moment for me to talk about what we can do, or are there more questions about the actual numbers? Yeah.
What is the historical value? We spoke of lead, but what about arsenic or cadmium?
I don't think we're very confident in those numbers. And there's just not very many samples, unfortunately. Yeah.
Just a question about interpreting results. You keep talking about parts per million. My Cap LA results are milligrams over kilograms.
Sure, that's, they're the same.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so if you had 80 milligrams per kilogram, that'd be 80 parts per million.
Okay. So when it says the lowest amount detected and the highest amount detected, that's still parts per million?
Well, yeah, I mean, they're reporting in milligrams per kilogram, but the conversion between those is 1. So 1 part per million is 1 milligram per kilogram.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I should have said that.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
A comment and a question. Early on, we got advice, 20 years ago, saying don't let your kid play in the dirt next to your house.
Yeah.
Because likely the sanding, when you
totally,
paint,
because of the paint.
Yeah, exactly. So, and our next door neighbor tested their soil in 2021 and got 60 parts per million.
Oh wow, cool. Thank you for telling me that.
There's a tiny bit of data.
Did they retest after the fire?
Yeah, it's 120.
Yeah, interesting. So plus 60.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting.
So, and then
that stinks for them, sorry. I should have said that.
Your talk is a little bit misleading because we haven't heard the bioavailability results. So
oh yeah, I mean, I can definitely show you that, for sure.
As a scientist myself, I'm very curious what the form of the lead is, right?
Yeah.
We know, because XRF doesn't tell you that, right?
No.
And I've done some SEM work to look for particles of lead and haven't found any.
Yeah.
Just zinc.
Oh, really?
So the lead's got to be really tiny, or just, is it interspersed with other stuff?
Yeah, I'll show you a few figures for sure. Yeah, I usually I feel like I always want to nerd out about the geochemistry of what's going on, and then everyone's just wanting to ask me can I eat my tomatoes? So yeah, you're right. I mean, totally misleading. Hopefully in a way that is satisfying to many people here. But yeah, okay. So did you also have a question?
Yeah. What is the bioavailability?
Yeah, I'll show you the hottest off the presses results.
Okay.
Oh yeah. Oh, how bioavailable do we think this lead is? And the answer is we still don't know. But, don't let me forget to go back about the vegetable stuff, because I know a lot of people have questions about that. Okay, so this is the latest and greatest. I think we're the only team that has any of these results, although the team in Purdue and one of the teams at UCLA is doing something kind of similar. So what you're looking at here is the y-axis is percent bioaccessibility on average. So we did a couple of different trials with each soil sample. And this is so hot off the presses, these graphics aren't even nice. Thank you for your patience. So this is one house, another house, a third house, a fourth house. So to my knowledge, these are the only 4 houses that have gone through any trial like this in LA so far. So small sample size alert. But yeah, broadly, we're getting roughly, the colors go how deep they are. So in our unburned homes, the deeper down stuff, so this would be Bioavailable Heaven, etc. The deeper down stuff has a higher bar, meaning a higher percentage of bioavailability. So more, let's say you consume 1 unit of lead, a larger proportion of that is getting into your bloodstream after it goes through your digestive tract. Then the stuff on the surface, which we rule of thumb, think is probably newer. And in this particular case, maybe is ash from the Eden fire, question mark. So that's actually kind of a good story if that ends up holding, that the stuff further down that your dog isn't going to get to, your kid isn't going to get to, is probably a little bit more hazardous than the stuff at the top. We're not totally sure, our hypothesis was going to be that this house of the burned houses was sort of representative, where the very new stuff at the top was super bioaccessible, and then the old stuff not as much. But
Define bioaccessible.
Sorry?
Define bioaccessible.
Oh, yeah. So I think I mentioned that before. It's sort of what proportion of whatever contaminant you're consuming is making it into your tissues. And in this case, we're looking at how much would get into your bloodstream. But it could also be you could measure bioaccessibility by saying well, how much made it into X tissue or Y tissue within your body. But in this case, we're doing that thing I was talking about with the kind of fake stomach, to say, okay, you dump some soil in a fake stomach, make it go through fake digestion, and you look at the end of how much would have dissolved into your body. So we're looking at between 35% and 65%. But yeah, those are our numbers. And then I'll show you one other thing, which is also very hot off the presses that we don't have quantitative data about yet. But we're using basically extremely souped up, fancy, sort of fluorescence data to look at kind of what forms these different metals are in. So what you're looking at here is basically a fluorescence response. So imagine a photo, but of only certain wavelengths of light. And this is particularly looking at lead. So this is basically a slide of a bunch of particles of ash-impacted soil from around Eaton. And when things are turning bright, that means there's lead there. So you can see that sometimes what this looks like is a bunch of lead that's sort of what we sometimes call sorbed, or sort of stuck on to a soil particle. So imagine this is a little tiny soil particle not visible to the naked eye, and it's got a bunch of lead sticky to the outside. So that we broadly would think of if you ingest that soil particle, that stuff can get sloughed off into your stomach a lot more easily. But this particle, for instance, where everything's kind of in the middle, maybe that's just going through your digestive tract and not very much is sloughing off before you poop it out. And then you can see this kind of plays out differently, a little nodule of stuff, that could be some tiny particulate of the lead in that paint or whatever. So a lot of remediation decisions are very broadly if you're trying to remediate heavy metals, so not something that can be organically broken down, not PFAS, not PAHs, you pretty much have to take them away or lock them up so that they don't actually get into your system. So you might have heard things like, oh, if you add compost, that can kind of like alter the form of lead, so it makes it a little bit less hazardous. And at the geochemical level, we're basically trying to convert from this to something like this. So like immobilizing that lead, or what's along the edge can kind of be more or less sorbed, like more or less sticky to soil particles. And you want it to be really sticky, so that when you are ingesting the soil particles, it's just kind of like staying on them while they wind their way through the system and then like come out as poop. Instead of getting dissolved in the acid of your stomach and then going into your bloodstream. Questions?
I was curious on the study of your own home. Did you do soil samples before and after we had that big rainstorm? Was there any impact?
Yeah, we made it to 6 homes before that rainstorm, and then we did repeat test them all, and we did not see a statistically significant reduction in any of the metals of interest. And our study's only testing metals. So, like, question mark? Yeah, basically, we saw no change. Yeah.
A very personal question.
Yeah. I brought my kid. All good. Yeah.
So
She's gone. Yeah.
I have a kid too. She's 11. Like, long story short, cutting to the chase. Should I grow vegetables in my backyard?
Yeah.
Should I eat the fruit on my fruit cheese? Should I, that's all I really want to know.
About the fruit and vegetables.
I mean,
Yeah.
fruits and vegetables.
Yeah, fruits and vegetables
also,
specifically.
Like, or like, what are you doing? It's like,
Yeah, totally.
What do you do?
I mean, I always tell people, no, you don't, you can be very offensive about
I
it.
just kind of want to know.
Yeah, no, totally.
You're doing, and then I'll-
Yeah, absolutely. So let me make sure I didn't miss anything I really wanted to talk about. There was one thing. So broadly, we sort of talked about this, but like fine particles are enriched in bad stuff. So a big part of the remediation and kind of like protection advice is looking at reducing how much of this like very fine dust from your soil you are actually ingesting. And that could be by either breathing it in or having it get into your mouth because you like whatever, wipe your nose, blah, blah, blah. And also, if your kid does eat mud pies, like don't let them do that probably. So I'll just point out, like, first line of attack, I just stole this from USC. How can you reduce your light exposure? So this is all backed up, like, these are the stories that everyone is telling. California Department, LA County Department of Public Health, California Department of Toxic Substance Control, all of these different experts, etc. So first thing you do is if you know a part of your yard is really in rough shape, like very bad numbers, don't let vulnerable people like hang out there. Vulnerable people are mostly children. The science on this is changing a lot. We used to say, oh, if your kid's over 3, it's totally fine. We do not think that way anymore. Now it's basically like probably anything up until 25 when your brain is kind of done forming, but certainly up until, preteens, and then probably like another level of hazard is if you're under the 6, and then another level of hazard is if you're under 3. So, yeah, the younger, the worse it is to be exposed to this stuff. And people who are gestating a baby, so pregnant people. Like, for instance, our daughter, like, before we did any remediation in the backyard, we just pretty much didn't let her play there for a little while we, like, figured out what to do. So, suit up and wash up is kind of related. This is basically, like, trying to let there be less soil on your hands, on your mouth, on the floor in your house, which then makes it onto your hands, onto your table, etc. So things we've done in our house is we took off shoes at the doors before, but we were kind of loose about it. Now we're very strict. Like guests in our home, they take their shoes off. We also are slightly gross and dirty, and we did not mop frequently before, and now we mop more regularly. Not like every day, but we're doing a full wet mop like at least once a month, and then like around the door, if we track in a bunch of stuff, we're kind of like wiping that area. We're like vacuuming any rugs near the door very, very frequently. And then the other kind of like related thing that we're doing is, my kid always kind of like washed her hands after she played outside, but we've gotten way more intense about that. So we used to let her eat snacks outside when she was playing. Now if she's outside and wants a snack, we go and wash our hands, and then we can go back outside, but we have to like eat the snack before we're touching the ground again. And we always wash our hands when we come back inside. So kind of like in that way that COVID habits, you could sort of just say like, this is the new reality, like we are washing our hands a lot. We've sort of like tried to transition to that mode. And then cover up is ultimately what we did in our house to buy time. I do not think this is a long-term solution. I can talk about why. We brought in a couple of inches of mulch and we just dumped it everywhere that our kid plays. And then we brought in a couple of inches of wood chips and dumped that on top. And the thought there is that like, whatever bad stuff, it's a couple inches down now. And we sort of imagined it as like a wet blanket of like, this is the dust that we do not want entering our kids' digestive system. So we're just dumping a bunch of stuff on top. And I'm usually pretty blunt with people that that's what we've done. The reason I don't think that's a long-term solution is all of that material is organic, right? Like mulch breaks down. You don't put mulch out once and it doesn't stay there forever, right? We think that probably buys us a year. And we did that, we because of kind of like the way our attic was, we needed smoke remediation in our house, so we were out for a while. And we knew we were going back to the house and that we wouldn't be able to tell our kid you could never go in the backyard again. So we needed something fast, cheap and dirty, and cheap in terms of money. So like that whole intervention, we paid like $1,200 bucks. If we've been willing to do the labor ourselves, I also am usually pretty candid that that's how much we paid. Like we paid a mulch guy to do it. Or we did like compost mulch combo and then wood chips. But there is free compost and free mulch available at several different locations through the County of LA. So like we also have been, our team has been advocating for that as like a short-term fix. A more expensive short-term fix that I don't think is going to be that popular in a place like Bungalow Heaven is, I know a lot of people who have decided to just like bring in turf, so like new grass to go on top of soil. But like very broadly, the big picture is if you have a hazard on the top of your soil, you can limit how much you're interacting with that hazard and limit how much that interaction actually leads to you consuming it. And again, these are really mostly for metals, like PAHs, PFAS. We're probably going to be thinking longer term about if we want to do any kind of bioremediation. But I'm sorry if this is too personal, like frankly we were just totally overwhelmed. And we were like, we just need something we can do now while our kid is still 2.5. That gave us some level of confidence. And it feels bad not doing picnics in the backyard anymore, but like, we basically can't deal. But probably many of you have way more bandwidth than I do and could be much more thoughtful than I could. So I always tell people that's what we're doing, but I do not think, I would say our solution in my personal household was driven in part by vibes. And I would also say that if you do not have a child at home or a pregnant person at home, like honestly, I don't think you need to be like feeling like you have to sell your house, if that makes sense. Like, I think the level of vulnerability of the people interacting with your yard really drives how much intervention you might want to make. And actually, I know I was going to circle back to you. Can you remind me what your question was? It was fruits and vegetables. Yeah, so. No, but you originally had a question about how you're 77 and maybe you should do nothing.
Oh, yeah, the arsenic, the carcinogens. I'm 77. By the time I would get cancer from any of this stuff, I'm going to be dead anyway.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, like, I don't judge anyone for getting through a natural disaster like this in any way that they're able to. We all have really different levels of resources, both financial, temporal, social, etc., educational. So I'm not going to judge. Like, people have told me all sorts of things they're doing, all the way from nothing to extremely expensive interventions. And like, I do not have a dog in the fight. That said, like, our household, I do think that if you have vulnerable people living in your home, right, if you don't have vulnerable people living in your home, you can probably think about this pretty differently than people who do have vulnerable people living in their home. So if you feel like, I'm 77, I don't want to do anything, I would encourage you to feel empowered by that. And that, like, I'm not walking away being like, wow, can you believe it? Do you know what I mean? Like, I think that, like, in large part, this sort of reminds me of the beginning of COVID, right? Like, or maybe in the middle of COVID, when we all sort of, like, knew more, not everything, and we could make more decisions that fit our personal situation, I guess. Does that help? And we'll talk about the fruits and vegetables too. Okay.
Yeah, she was the fruits and vegetables.
Yeah, totally. Yes.
So, growing up, my grandmother always said we had to eat a pound of dirt before you grew up. I mean, she wasn't fastidious about washing everything,
Sure.
you know, pacify or whatever. But is the risk here if you eat this that you're gonna, you know, is carcinogenic? Is that what we're talking about?
No, I think what public health experts are mostly worried about for lead is kind of like neurological impacts. So for the most part, we think of increased lead levels in the blood for children as being associated with things like lower IQ, higher rates of kind of like different forms of neurodivergence, especially ADHD, at really high levels, things like oppositional defiance disorder, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why, especially related to lead, the hazards are mostly related to how developed your brain is already. Not because of brain cancer, but more because of like neuronal growth.
Okay, so then for the age-related question, it would be more like bringing on Alzheimer's faster or something like that?
Yeah, I think probably. And you know, those effects are so diffuse. Yeah, but those effects are so diffuse that I don't think we're not that confident in a lot of those relationships. Hence why I think there's such a focus on young kids, because there's really clear relationships between, like, you know, basically if you look at these graphs of like going back to the 60s and 70s, when kids routinely had much higher blood levels than kids do now, like higher blood levels is associated with all of these negative impacts. Higher rates of ADHD, lower IQ, et cetera.
That's all brain stuff.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few other things too, but I think what public health researchers are really clued in on is, brain stuff, pretty much. I think there was a hand over here.
I've been hearing that none of the blood level testing that's been going on has been showing elevated levels.
Yes.
What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really optimistic. So to repeat the question, because of these elevated blood levels in soils around us and, you know, in soot and ash inside of homes that kind of in the immediate had smoke and ash intrusion, there's been a push to test people's blood levels. And I'm on a working group that's run by the county Department of Public Health. And the last meeting I was at, where they talked about these results, and they had tested like 3,000 people, and only like 4 had come back with elevated blood levels. So that's really great. And none of them are children. That said, like, this stuff is cumulative over time. So for my own child, we had her tested at the pediatrician. We also tested my dog, and both my spouse and I, all of us are good to go. But like, you know, there's kind of like cumulative impact. So for my kid, we were really torn about this. We're testing her again in 6 months. I don't know, that felt reasonable. Of course, if it comes back elevated later, I'll feel like I wish we had tested in 3 months. But we kind of weighed how much data we wanted against how difficult it was to draw her blood and how young she is. I think, you know, and also like how often you want to drag your kid to the doctor. Like maybe you have a 7-year-old who can withstand having their blood drawn all the time, but like every 3 months you go to the doctor just to get their blood tested. Like, what we settled on our pediatrician was, if we're still good the second 6 months, maybe we'll go to once a year. I don't know. Question mark. We probably won't do the dog again. He's not a puppy, so his brain's developed. Yes.
Yeah, like, so many of us have mixed backyards, so like my backyard is grass, maybe 60% grass and 40% dirt. I'm just just took out all my grass in the front yard, so it's all dirt.
Yeah,
Would you say the grass is a little safer to be in?
yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so basically like imagine, like sometimes you'll see the advice like don't have your kids play in the bare dirt. So the idea is basically like if your kid is running your hand along grass, they're just not touching, they're not getting as many fine particles attached to their hand. And the way these fine particles attach to your hand is they're basically like electrostatically doing that. So, you know, sort of like imagine static electricity, like you touch something, it comes off on your hand. So yeah, like if your hand isn't like rubbing over as many fine particles, it's not gonna be on your hand as easily. So yeah, one rule of thumb is like have your vulnerable people like picnic on the grass part instead of the mulch part, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Speaking of dogs, I have a dog, and early on afterwards, I was really vigilant about wiping off his paws after the walk, because I realized I didn't take off my shoes. Essentially, he's walking around with his shoes on, unless I wipe off his paws. I've stopped doing that.
Sure.
But should I continue doing that? Should I bathe him more often? He's a fluffy poodle.
Yeah.
Adorable. I'm biased, but you know, his fur.
I'm sure he's so adorable. Do not shave him. Yeah. Do what you need to do, but.
No, you leave him. Anyway.
Yeah.
So, but should we bathe him more? Like he does seem like a dust trap.
Totally. I mean, so we also were wiping our dog's paws and we are not any longer.
Okay.
Part of that is because we dumped all this new stuff on top of our soil so that we were like, see you never, Ash. That's not true. See you in 6 to 18 months. So like when you migrate back to the top. Yeah, I guess we kind of like just felt like we needed to have some balance between interventions. We were like, okay, we overall want there to be less ingestion of soil. And so it felt more tractable to us to have our kid wash their hands all the time than to always make my dog wipe his paws. But there's probably some households where like your kid really hates washing their hands, so like that's going to be more difficult than like wiping the dog's paws. Or like maybe if you really hate to mop, you'd rather wipe your dog's paws and not mop that much. I don't know. I think these are all like, again, the Swiss cheese model of protecting yourself from COVID. Like you're having intervention, and like, you know, there's every household and every person can have a different number of interventions that they're able to sustainably withstand for in the long term. Yeah.
So could you talk a little bit about the difference between ingesting the lead and inhaling the lead?
Yeah, I mean...
Because I'm just to follow up, because one thing that I noticed today, I was in our McDonald Park doing Tai Chi, and a gardener across the street is leaf blowing.
Totally.
This huge cloud of dust that's going in the street, in the park, in the neighbor's house, and also it's gas driven, which I understand that it's supposed to be
illegal.
Electric only, and frankly, I think there should be no leaf blowing.
Yeah.
And I really want to talk to the people here, if you have gardeners, to make sure it's your responsibility to tell your gardener, you know, I mean, inform them.
Yeah, I'll say this isn't my area of research or expertise, but my understanding is that lead, you're a little more concerned about ingesting, but a lot of these other contaminants are a little more concerned about inhaling. So like PAHs, maybe PFAS, etc. I don't think it's great to be having any contaminated soil making it into your body. And I think there's a lot of open questions about, like I'm a study subject in the UCLA long-term health study, so I don't know anything about it professionally. I just showed up and had a bunch of stuff done. And they did do, so I kind of know what their research questions are just from chatting with them and stuff. And yeah, I think they're very interested in kind of like lung capacity, stuff like that. And really long term, I think they're on the lookout for things like lung cancer rates. But I suspect, you know, that kind of stuff, unless you were like a frontline firefighter, these are going to be very small amounts of elevation at a very large population level. So I don't think it's the kind of thing, I'm not walking around feeling like, oh my God, I'm getting lung cancer right now.
But then also, you're taking, like somebody's clean, maybe they have a clean yard, and you're taking your contaminant.
Oh yeah, I don't think it's,
moving it to
for
the,
sure.
you know, somewhere else. So,
yeah, like,
yes.
Yeah, it is not recommended to be using a leaf blower right now.
But that's all you see on our street, that's all you see.
Yeah, totally.
It's really
Yeah.
What about HEPA filters and charcoal filters? We used that early on, obviously, for the smoke. But we just kept ours running all the time.
Still recommended, for sure, yeah, because like, to go back to the dog paw question, like, you're bringing stuff into your house even if you take your shoes off, so like, yeah, we're still running ours, and it's California, like, air quality's not that great, so we're like, yeah, it's great to be running these all the time. Like, one recommendation is that your vacuums, if they don't already have a HEPA filter, like, and you're upgrading your vacuum anyway, that's a great intervention. Yeah, like the very broad picture is a bunch of ash with gross stuff in it got dumped in our part of town, and for the foreseeable future, we should all be trying to have less soot, ash, and dust going into our bodies, and there's a lot of different ways to do that. I think filtering your air and not having it be filled with dust is a really good intervention, for sure. Yeah, I want to make sure we have time for the fruits and veggies, so stop me in a few minutes as well.
This may lead you on to that. Are you going to plan on doing any remediation in your garden, like take soil up and replace it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, yeah. To be honest, like, we're like low-key broke, so I don't really know like exactly when we're gonna do that, but yeah, I think if that's available to you, I mean, it depends on your numbers, right? Like, we know that our house is like, some patches are hovering like close to 200, but a lot of our patches are hovering around 80. So we're like, that doesn't feel like so catastrophic, but we have a young kid. So I don't know.
An 18-month-old, we have 300 to 600.
Yeah, oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I mean, I think that doing something is probably, doing something but
I just wanted to also just like, the recommendation has been 6 inches. Do you have an opinion?
Yeah, I mean, that's the recommendation for like burned down debris. So basically, like the question was, what's the deal with the going 6 inches down in your soil? So our study and several others are doing things like testing 0, 3, and 6 inches. And like I mentioned before, like sometimes 6 inches isn't that great, you know what I mean? So what the Army Corps of Engineers is doing is basically in the shadow of whatever kind of debris, like I think they're calling it like the debris line shadow. So imagine like square house and then also like some eaves or whatever, like they're digging out that perimeter down to 6 inches. So that's where that 6 inches comes from. I think if we were gonna do an intervention in our house, which like I said, just for full transparency, like we basically put down a bunch of stuff on top so we didn't have to think about this for a little while we just like kind of got our acts together. I think I would probably, like my gut reaction would be I'd probably get quotes to either scrape a couple of inches and put in new stuff and just dumping way more new stuff on top. I think probably more important than how deep you go is making sure the new stuff you put down is clean. Because like that could be, you know, like who knows where that soil is sourced from. So it's probably worth staying like, or like being confident that you're getting soils not from like somewhere else around LA County. Yeah.
Didn't your data show that the further down you went in 3 or 4 samples?
I was gonna say it's 2 houses, but yeah.
Well, it was, so do you really want to go down to those levels?
Well, so those levels are more, our data from, again, 4 houses, taken with a grain of salt, is that the further down lead is more bioaccessible, but that doesn't necessarily mean there was more of it. So it could be like 70% of only 100 parts per million, but 30% of 360 parts per million, you're still getting more lead on the top. Do you know what I'm saying?
Okay.
Yeah, so it's like, basically how easy is it for that lead to get into your body versus how much there is, and you kind of need both pieces of information.
Don't the EPA and California recommendations, does that essentially implicitly factor into bioavailability?
Yeah, so the California recommendation comes from a model called the lead spread. There's been several iterations. We're now on lead spread 9. It's run by the state, like it was developed by the state and that's who runs it. And basically the number 80 came from like using that model to back calculate if your red line is that you don't want a child's blood lead level to go up by 1 microgram, 1 unit of something per milliliter, which is associated with a drop of 1 IQ point. Like, to not have that happen, then how much lead can there be? So there's a bunch of assumptions between that kid, hypothetical kid in the model, having this 1 increase in their blood level, which is associated with 1 decrease in IQ. So in that model is things like how bioaccessible is the lead. It also assumes that that particular fake model child is outside for like Y hours per day, and that they touch their face Z number of times, etc. So most of those assumptions are pretty liberal. Like they wanted to err on the side of caution. There was a big kind of like perspectives piece that came out of the Harvard Public Health School 3 weeks ago, arguing that 80 is a little bit too high. It actually probably should have been set at 55. But that is like 10 authors, literally brand new, came out August 15th. Or actually, I think it was like August 9th. But like, no one has even responded to that yet. So yeah, there's a lot of assumptions in here. And I think like, I'm sorry, I totally forget your name, but like, we're assuming that we're concerned about these lead levels because they're going to raise blood levels. And like, so far that's not occurring. Question mark. So we're not in a Flint, Michigan situation in that we're not immediately seeing increased lead blood levels widely across the population. So whatever is going on, and this is a big open question, is it's not like everyone's pinging for like elevated lead, elevated lead, elevated lead. And again, like I'm happy to take questions about contaminants other than lead, but I do think there are reasons why everyone's very interested in lead. Mostly the amount of contamination of lead and the kind of like proximate public health interests. But we're really focusing on metals, and there's also this enormous black box of all this other stuff. Did I answer your question? Okay. Yeah.
I'm curious that there's no mention on this USC what to do list about planting plants that extract lead.
Yeah, there actually is. Sorry, I just felt like we were going to get to it. So this is supposed to be a little raised bed. So they also advocate for only eating things that are grown on a raised bed.
Oh, that wasn't what I meant.
Oh, sorry.
I've read that.
Oh, you mean like planting sunflowers so that they take up lead? Yeah, USC and most of these other guys are agnostic about what to do next, unfortunately. This is mostly about, this is kind of like a, so you have contaminated soil. Like, what do I do now? And this is like, I know they were very focused on like free proximate interventions. But yeah, I'm on a working group that's like, of course, everyone's like, I know my numbers, or I've decided not to find out my numbers, but I know my neighbor's numbers. Like, what am I supposed to do? And so far, unfortunately, there has not been like a set of recommendations. And I think that's in part because people have really different budgets, and insurance, for the most part, is not choosing to cover any of these interventions. Like, you usually got a claim for smoke and ash remediation. I haven't heard of very many instances in which that claim is leading to like yard remediation at all. So I think people feel a little bit on their own. And there's also like a relatively limited number of companies that are taking on this kind of work. Yeah, so anyway, but very broadly, yeah, we actually do have pretty good data showing that there are plants that are basically very thirsty for heavy metals, not only lead, they usually also, the ones that like lead usually take up arsenic and a bunch of other metals too. So if you do go this route, so let's say you know this part of your yard has really bad metal numbers, you're gonna plant a bunch of sunflowers. People usually laugh when I say this, but I don't think this is silly. Don't let the flowers like decompose back into the yard. You need to like harvest them and then like throw them away. So the idea is like they're taking up the lead, it's in all their tissues, and you need to like dump that stuff. Everybody always laughs, but I don't think that's that obvious. I wouldn't want anyone to think like I did it. And then they like just have sunflowers that are like recycling lead back into their yard.
Because I probably would have done that.
Yeah, no, I always am like, I feel bad that people are laughing about this. Or the other thing I always say is cilantro is also very hungry for lead. So don't eat the cilantro if you plant cilantro. Dump it. And actually the city of Pasadena doesn't want you to put it in yard waste. They want you to put stuff that you think might be contaminated with metals in the trash can. Yeah, which I don't know what the long-term plan is there, but I don't know. Yeah.
Sort of on that same vein, is it safe to use, if you have a lot of lead in your yard, is it safe to use your grass clippings in your compost bin?
And are you then putting that compost like onto things you might eat?
No, not the things I might eat, but to help remediate the soil.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's potentially going to introduce lead back into your yard, but I think grass isn't that hungry for metals, so like turf grass.
Which brings us back.
Yeah, exactly. We can finally get to the fruits and veggies. Okay, let me make sure there wasn't anything else I wanted to talk about. Okay, blah, 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 blah. Great, fruits and veggies. So I've built this up so much, but unfortunately we don't have very good data about this. So, okay, what about eating things that grow in your yard? Unfortunately, an area where, to my knowledge, we have no local data. I don't know of any teams that have done systematic testing after the Eden or Palisades fire about this, but it's only been 8 months. Globally, the data is mixed. So there are not a ton of studies looking at this, especially surrounding fruit, which is what a lot of people in Bungalow have are growing. These studies range from like urban Berlin, where they looked at stone fruits, and basically nothing was elevated above the WHO recommendation. So that would be like a great story for us. But oranges in Nigeria were elevated above the WHO recommendation, even though these two studies had roughly about the same amount of soil-like contamination, and it was vaguely on par with our situation here. But you know, I don't think this necessarily means anything about stone fruits versus oranges. Like in science, you need a lot of replicated studies before you're confident, and this could just be like the methods they used in that study versus that one, or whatever. So our team, this is a little plug, we've been collecting fruit since February, but we don't have any money yet to process any of those samples. And I did ask the National Science Foundation for $750,000 the other month, and I have a feeling that's not going to go anywhere. But you never know. Hope springs eternal. But no, I think that this is a huge question that will get funded. Someone is going to know the answer to this for our area soon. Like, we are not the only team interested in this. We're very close with the other teams who are working on this stuff too. So like, between the UCLA teams, us, and the USC teams, we all want to know the answer to this question. We all get this question all the time. I'm very confident we will eventually know the answer. And the growing season for our area, for a lot of the most interesting things, like only just happened. So we haven't like totally screwed up yet, I hope. I'll give you a few rules of thumb. This is from a paper that is kind of like rounding up. It's called Legacy Lead in Urban Garden Soils. So legacy meaning historical lead, communicating risk and limiting exposure. So very broadly, and this is a review paper, meaning they're looking at the body of work we know as a scientific community. So very broadly, crop type, meaning what type of fruit or vegetable, we think of as more important than, this says soil amendment, but that's basically like soil remediation intervention. So like what kind of thing you're eating on a contaminated soil matters more than honestly how contaminated your soil is. Like in some of these studies, these are really contaminated soils, and the actual edible part of the plant's not taking anything up. Because plants don't want to transport a heavy element from their roots up their shoot out into the part that holds their seeds, right? Like they want to put sugar into their fruit so a bird eats it and poops out their seeds somewhere else so that they propagate their genes. They don't want to waste any like energy moving lead around the plant's body, for the most part. Okay, so very, very, very big picture. We think of leafy vegetables as the most likely to be contaminated. This is due in part to two things. One, like leaves of plants are kind of like, tend to be more related to what's in the soil than like the good stuff, like the fruiting body, which is either the fruit or the eating part of the vegetable. And because the leafy part of things we eat gets dust from the ground. So a big part of what's probably making leafy vegetables more dangerous to eat from contaminated soils is that they have actual dust from those contaminated soils on them. So one of the main pieces of advice about leafy vegetables is to wash them, all of these types, to wash them very thoroughly. And then I think especially with things like leafy vegetables, that's gonna help a lot. And then again, very big picture, like leafy vegetables are kind of like the worst, the most likely to be contaminated. Then probably like root vegetables, so if you're like actually in the soil, that you kind of tend to be like absorbing more stuff. Like here's a different study that to give you a sense of what that actually looks like. Onion was worse than kale, which was worse than eggplant, which was worse than cabbage, which is kind of interesting. I think in this study, they like peeled the entire outside of the cabbage off, so they didn't have to worry about washing as much. And then tomatoes actually performed pretty well. So people ask me about tomatoes all the time, and I'm like, oh, there's hardly any studies where tomatoes are taking up a ton of lead. And like another study looked at, basically all of the kind of like bad outcomes were leafy things. Chard, collard greens, mint, cilantro, and then like stuff that's under the ground. Carrot, onion, radish, etc. So these are things that like tend to have more lead. So yeah, I'll also tell you, if it's not too much, what we're doing in my household. We have a lot of fruits in our yard. We do not let children or pregnant people eat those fruits. And we warn adults that we haven't gotten them tested. Good luck. And like TBD, my own vegetables and fruits are in our study, which I hope one day means they'll get tested, but I don't know, that's also kind of like a vibes decision. To be honest, most people we tell that to choose not to eat the fruit from our yard because they're probably like, wow, that sounds horrible. I don't want to eat your orange when I could just go to the store and get an orange. Okay, you probably have a lot of questions about fruits and vegetables. Yes?
Well, if you have a mature orange tree, say, where the roots go down really far.
Sure.
Doesn't that mean that it won't have taken up?
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why. And so most of these studies are actually looking at vegetables because, again, very big picture, vegetables tend to be more correlated with soil contaminant level than fruits. So like, there's kind of this ranking of like, these vegetables are worse, but then very big pictures like vegetables are usually worse than fruit. So like, mostly because roots are really deep, but some of these like studies, the contamination is also deep, right?
Probably why tomato is so over there, because tomato is a fruit.
Yeah, exactly. And I think a big part of this theory is probably like, if you're a plant and you're investing in, you know, like all living things want to propagate their genes, so you're like building your entire life strategy around having your seeds get spread. So you want your fruit to be like, you know, really good for things to eat. And so very broadly, we tend to use that as the rule of thumb of like, fruit is going to have less garbage in it. Yeah.
Well, back to sunflowers and not letting them decompose. Isn't it good to let them seed? Are the seeds bad? You know, because
Oh yeah, I mean, I think like if you're taking away most of the mass of that sunflower, yeah, I think you're definitely like taking away lead on net. And very broadly, I'm not that familiar with these studies about sunflower specifically, but I think usually the like stalk of a plant is going to be where most of these contaminants are concentrated.
So you can let it seed then and then have.
Oh yeah, because I think you're totally good to put out more. Yeah. And like even if the seeds have a small amount of lead, it's not like the plant grows with lead in it. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You didn't mention strawberries. They have shallow roots and they grow close to the ground.
They're dirty fruit.
So
They're dirty fruit.
Oh yeah. Oh,
historically.
Okay.
Berries, yeah.
Awesome. I do not know anything about berries, so I'm really glad that
Because it also depends on like how the root system develops.
Yeah, for sure.
Deep and, you know,
yeah, totally.
absorption.
Yeah, I have heard a rule of thumb that berries tend to be like slightly more contaminated, but again, I think a huge part of the reason why we don't have good data about this is like there's just so little data on urban agriculture in general, and then like for instance, when we were collecting fruit, when we were out looking at soil samples in July, and you know we're like collecting fruit as we go or whatever, and we're just not going to have a lot of replication of like there were passion fruits at like 2 people's houses. So it's like, you know, these really like specified urban agricultural products, it's really hard to find solid data on like what this means for this kind of strawberry. I'm sorry, no, that's not very satisfying. Okay, interventions, wash fruits, we talked about that, and raised beds. That's pretty much
question. It's still related to
fruit?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any food. Yeah. What about new planting? Like I would obviously do pots and raised beds, but
I think you're good.
Even with like mowing and
the weed whacking and all, just the particulates that might be still floating out there?
This is not data driven, but yeah, I mean, I think that
Personal opinion.
Yeah, my personal opinion is that like the amount of kind of like combustion material that landed on our yards after the Eden fire so eclipses the amount of like random dust from mowing or whatever that I don't think it would be enough to contaminate a raised bed of fresh soil. And even if it was, like, I don't think it would be enough to then, like, plants do not have a one-to-one relationship of like, if there's 80 parts per million lead in your soil, there's not 80 parts per million lead in your plant. It's like very loosely associated. So I think like this stuff is all in bulk basically. So yeah, like we are going to put raised beds in our backyard before we do any other remediation, and we're not going to be worried about them, I don't think.
Do you have an email address on one of your slides?
I'm Christine O'Connell, cocon@chapman.edu. Email me anytime. I also live on Wilson, so stop by the house. We're the house on Wilson, just north of the park. Yeah.
When you had the blood study done, did you ask for other things to be examined?
Me personally?
Yeah.
Yeah, we got arsenic done on everybody too, and all good. But the doctor was starting to be like, do you know what I mean? We had to push for arsenic. So I probably could have been like, and I want cadmium. And I feel like they would have been like, no. I don't know, we didn't push for anything else.
Yeah.
Like, this is an aside, because we're feeling loose at the end of the night. At the vet, you would not believe the reaction. They were like, sorry, you're calling about what? I was like, a lead blood test for my dog. They were like, I was like, I think insurance will cover it. They did, by the way. And then I was like, and arsenic. And they were like, we have to send that to Michigan. I was like, do it. So yeah, access Pasadena.
Just ask the doctor for a lead and arsenic.
Yeah, there'll be two different tests.
He'll know what the codes are.
Yeah, like we go to UCLA and they had it in the drop-down menu. I think if I'd asked for things beyond that, they would have been like, that's not in the drop-down menu. But
I get tested quarterly for my diabetes.
oh, totally, yeah.
I just want to add it to the regular list.
Yeah, exactly. Like I did this, my daughter and dog, we had special appointments for because we wanted really quick data, but because my spouse and I are adults, we just like, the next time we went in, said, I want you to have this on. Yeah.
So it sounded like you said, in general, blood levels of lead have not increased, except for some cases, and I don't know what proportion of that.
Well, I mean, we have no idea if those people already had elevated blood levels, so we
Right.
don't know that it increased in those cases.
So then, how can we think about the long-term exposure relative to the parts per million present in our environments? When would we be expecting to see any kind of lead changes? Like a year, 5 years?
Yeah, I mean, this is also
how dirty we like to play in the yard, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is my area, and I don't think we totally know, but going off of places like Flint or other kind of like lead public health disasters, I think if stuff isn't showing up in a year, I'll breathe a lot easier. And we're 8 months in, so, but a lot of people haven't moved back to some of the more contaminated parts of town. So I feel like, yeah.
Is there a public place we can kind of see a kind of an aggregate monitoring of that?
I don't think any of the blood stuff is public yet. I suspect that what will go public first is the UCLA Harvard study, which is called LA Health. But right now, all they're putting out is kind of like broad guides to what they're finding, and they haven't made any of their kind of like human subject testing data available yet. I don't even know if they've worked it out, to be honest. But
Is that maybe like a year after the fact, maybe? Or?
yeah, I mean, I think they're still recruiting.
Oh,
so I think, are they? Does anyone know? I was included in their study like only a month ago or 2 months ago.
That would be my question. If we're the subject population,
Yeah, I mean, I'll say that one thing that's kind of nice is Bungalow Heaven, they have a control group and 2 intervention groups. We don't, this is not how they describe it, but there's basically people who live within the burn zone and then people who live within the next 2 miles, and we're that group. So we're already in the group where the experts think we're in They don't think, we're not the control group, I'll tell you that, but we're not the group with what they expect to be the highest level of risk. So I think I got an email that was like from my doctor, I think. But yeah, you can Google LA Health, and I'm pretty sure they had just like a big website where I just like entered a Google form and then they emailed me. Has anyone else done this?
No, we should share it.
Yeah.
Share it in the.
You said LA Health is doing that study?
Yeah, they're doing, it's a really big study. It's funded by, I think like Evan Spiegel's foundation. So they have a ton of response variables. And I think they also are doing a separate study looking at firefighters. Yeah.
Is there any reason to be concerned about the air while they're still being?
Yeah, I mean, kind of at the regional level, no. Like basically, I think at the regional level, we're very confident that air quality has stayed reduced after that first, immediate haze time. And it's being monitored pretty closely. So like our area in Bungalow Heaven hasn't pinged at all. There is a little more data that's like looked at, dust getting kicked up by the trucks removing debris. And I think, indeed, that dust is getting kicked up the same way it's getting kicked up if you're like, leaf blowing. But I don't think it's like migrating to our part of town at all. So like, I'm not personally concerned about that. And I think most researchers are like, air quality has not been one of the big, bright, like yellow, orange, or red flags. Other than during that initial time when I think that the consequences of that, like those 2 weeks, I think are still unknown, yeah.
When I'm assuming you evacuated Jericho, how far away, percentages, how far away did you go for how long?
We left for a long time. We were gone until we could get back in after remediation in April. But now I'm like, I don't think we went far enough. We went to Glendale, just because we had family. But I don't know, we had HEPA filters. I think there's a lot of open questions about like, how far away you needed to go. But also like, were you outside? Were you wearing a mask? Et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, I think.
Were you wearing a mask in Glendale?
Outside?
Yeah.
Yeah, we were. But our kid didn't, because she was too young to wear a mask. But I don't know, we're really cautious. Like, we're very risk-averse people. And not everyone's as risk-averse as us. And I don't know that everyone should be. I think sometimes I'm like, is this data-driven or is it clinical anxiety? Hard to know.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, I'm sorry if that's like very unsatisfying. I try to just be like we were all doing the best we could during that time and shove it down the memory hole, but that's my personal approach. Okay, I think we're getting kicked out at some point too.
Just one question, sorry, on the HEPA filters, so are you, HEPA air purifiers,
Yeah.
whatever, are you running those all the time in your home?
We are, but I think we already had like 2 of them that we ran all the time anyway. Because of like COVID, and so then we just like put one in more rooms. But like I said, I'm a very cautious person, so I think that's like slightly psychotic, and not everyone is behaving that way, and I recognize that. But sorry, what were you gonna say?
Insurance paid for a bunch of them, so I'm like, should I just be running these?
Yeah, we have like 6 on our house now. They're not even loud. So like, yeah, I just like dumped them in I was like, well, if someone slept in the room, we like dumped one in there. And if it was like a particularly dusty room, we dumped one in there too. I don't know, TBD. I feel like it can't hurt.
Right.
Yeah, they're ugly though.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I was just curious with the rinsing that hands off of your radar, is just rinsing off enough or do you need to wash it with water?
Yeah, I think that like rinsing reduces particulates on your hands substantially, and then like soap does a little bit more. So definitely rinsing is much better than doing nothing. Like the difference between nothing and rinsing is bigger than rinsing the soap. But soap is good. Words to live by. Anyway, thank you for having me. I'll be here.
Thank you so much.